January 1945. A bitter Belgian winter presses down on a lonely command trailer parked near the village of Zonhoven. The ground outside is frozen solid, churned into a blackened crust by weeks of artillery fire and tank treads. Snow still clings to the trees, but it is no longer white. It is stained with oil, ash, and blood. The Battle of the Bulge is finally burning itself out, leaving behind silence that feels almost unnatural after weeks of chaos. Inside the trailer, the air is heavy and sour. Damp wool uniforms hang from hooks, slowly steaming in the warmth of a small heater. The smell of mud, sweat, and stale cigarette smoke clings to everything. A single lamp casts a dull yellow glow over a narrow desk. Seated there alone is Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. He is not studying maps. He is not reviewing casualty lists. He is not listening to radio traffic from the front. His attention is fixed on something far more dangerous than any German panzer division, a typewriter. His fingers hover over the keys with calm precision. There is no hesitation, no doubt. When he begins to type, the sound cuts through the silence like gunfire. Clack, clack, clack. What appears on the page is not an operational order. It is not a plan to crush the remaining German forces. It is not a request for reinforcements or supplies. It is a political weapon, a carefully worded, razor-sharp message intended not for the enemy, but for his own allies. This telegram is meant for London, for the British High Command, for men who still believe they are directing the course of the war. In it, Montgomery commits an unforgivable act in coalition warfare. He does not merely criticize American strategy. He attacks the American army itself. He describes the men fighting and dying in the Ardennes as courageous but ineffective, brave yet fundamentally incapable. He portrays the United States command structure as chaotic, amateurish, and barely holding together. He presents himself as the lone professional in a sea of incompetence. Montgomery believes this message will elevate him. He believes it will finally force the issue he has been pushing for months. He believes it will expose Dwight D. Eisenhower as unfit to command and open the door for himself to take control of the Allied ground war. When he finishes typing, he reads the telegram once, nods in quiet satisfaction, and slips it into an envelope. He seals it with the confidence of a man who thinks he is invisible. He is not. That telegram is not simply a complaint. It is a fuse, and once lit, it will race toward an explosion powerful enough to tear the Allied coalition apart from the inside. To understand how the war nearly imploded in January 1945, you have to look past the newsreels and stage photographs, the smiling generals, the firm handshakes, the carefully constructed myth of unity between Britain and the United States. By late 1944, the so-called special relationship was anything but special. It was a strained, bitter partnership held together by necessity and fear, a marriage of convenience sustained by a single shared enemy. At the center of it all stood Dwight David Eisenhower. Eisenhower was not a battlefield genius in the traditional sense. He was not a Rommel or a Montgomery. His real talent lay elsewhere. He was a manager, a mediator, a man uniquely capable of controlling egos that were larger than armies. He spent his days smoothing over arguments, diffusing rivalries, and absorbing insults from subordinates who believed they were smarter than him. He chain-smoked constantly, burning through packs of cigarettes while shuttling between meetings, always listening, always compromising. Eisenhower represented something new and unsettling, the rise of the American superpower, industrial, democratic, endlessly productive, an army that could replace men, tanks, and aircraft faster than anyone in history. An army that did not rely on tradition or imperial prestige, but on factories, logistics, and sheer scale. Across from him stood Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery was everything Eisenhower was not, brilliant, meticulous, and deeply convinced of his own superiority. He was the hero of Elamagny, the general who had broken Rommel's Africa Corps and restored British pride after years of humiliation. He was also rigid, abrasive, and incapable of hiding his contempt for those he considered inferior. And in his mind, that category increasingly included the Americans. Montgomery did not see Eisenhower as his commander. He saw him as a facilitator, a pleasant administrator whose job was to manage supply depots and political relationships while real soldiers fought the war. To Monty, the British Army was the professional core of the Allied effort. The Americans were enthusiastic amateurs, well-undered, poorly disciplined, and dangerously impatient. For months, this tension simmered beneath the surface. Polite smiles masked private frustration. Meetings ended with handshakes that concealed resentment. Montgomery believed the war was dragging on because the Americans were fighting it wrong. In his view, they were too aggressive, too eager to attack everywhere at once, spreading themselves thin instead of focusing their strength. He wanted one massive, deliberate thrust into Germany, a single carefully prepared blow that would shatter the enemy. And of course, he wanted to lead it. Eisenhower refused. He believed in a broad, front strategy, constant pressure along the entire line, no pauses that would allow the Germans to regroup, no single axis that could fail catastrophically. It was not elegant, but it was relentless to Montgomery. This was proof of Eisenhower's inadequacy. To Eisenhower, Montgomery was a liability who had to be managed carefully. The resentment inside Montgomery built like steam trapped inside a sealed boiler. All it needed was a fracture. That fracture came in December 1944 in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. When German forces launched their massive surprise offensive, the Allied front collapsed with shocking speed. American units were overrun. Roads were choked with refugees and retreating troops. Communications disintegrated. Confusion spread through command posts that had never anticipated such a blow. To Montgomery, the crisis was not merely a disaster. It was confirmation. From his headquarters in the north, he studied the maps with a grim sense of vindication. This, he believed, was exactly what he had warned about. American recklessness had finally caught up with them. In his mind, the chaos was not tragic. It was proof. He convinced himself that the U.S. Army was teetering on the edge of total collapse, that only firm, professional leadership, British leadership, could prevent annihilation. This was Montgomery's savior complex in its purest form. He did not see himself as an ally rushing to assist a partner in trouble. He saw himself as a disciplinarian stepping in to restore order, a stern headmaster correcting unruly students who had made a mess of things. He assumed that once he stabilized the front, the Americans would be grateful, that they would recognize his brilliance and willingly hand him control of the war. He expected Washington and London to finally acknowledge what he believed was obvious. That Eisenhower was out of his depth, what Montgomery failed to understand, was the one factor that mattered more than all his theories and plans, the resilience of the American soldier, and that blindness was about to drag him into the most dangerous political confrontation of the war. The crisis did not begin with arrogance alone. It began with a decision that was logical, necessary, and profoundly dangerous. On December 19, 1944, the German panzer armies had driven a wedge deep into the Allied front. The penetration stretched nearly 45 miles, carving the battlefield into two disconnected halves. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group in the south was suddenly cut off from its northern formations. Telephone lines were severed, radio contact was unreliable, orders moved slower than the German tanks. Eisenhower studied the situation without emotion. He understood that sentiment had no place in the next move. The northern shoulder of the Bulge had to be stabilized immediately, and the only functioning headquarters with clear communications in that sector belonged to Montgomery. At 10:30 a.m. on December 20th, Eisenhower made the call. Temporarily and strictly for operational necessity, he transferred command of the U.S. First Army under General Courtney Hodes and the U.S. Ninth Army under General William Simpson to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. It was not a promotion, it was not a reward, it was a stopgap measure designed to restore cohesion. On paper, it was a clean solution. In reality, it was an earthquake. Overnight, Montgomery found himself in command of more than 200 American soldiers. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles, two entire armies representing the bulk of American combat power in the north, were now under British control. Eisenhower viewed the transfer as a loan. Montgomery viewed it as conquest. The moment the orders were confirmed, Montgomery's mindset shifted. He did not treat the American forces as partners temporarily placed under his authority. He treated them as assets to be reorganized, corrected, and restrained. The American instinct was to counterattack immediately, to strike back while the Germans were exposed and overextended. Montgomery rejected this outright. He ordered the northern flank to halt. He began a slow, methodical reorganization of the lines, insisting that every unit be perfectly aligned before any major movement. To Montgomery, precision mattered more than urgency. He refused to advance until everything met his exact standards. Time, however, was the one resource the Americans did not have. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. 7 German divisions pressed in from all sides. Supplies were running out. Casualties were mounting. The defenders radioed desperate pleas for relief. Montgomery did not accelerate. Instead, he inserted his own liaison officers into American headquarters. Young British majors, fresh and confident, who spoke to seasoned American commanders as if they were trainees. They questioned decisions. They corrected terminology. They lectured men who had been fighting continuously for months. General Bradley proposed a pincer movement to cut off the base of the Bulge. Montgomery vetoed it. He insisted the situation required patience, not haste. While Montgomery tidied his lines in the north, General George Patton moved. From the south, Patton executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. In brutal winter conditions, he pivoted 3 divisions 90 degrees and drove them north over 100 m in less than 48 hours. Through snowstorms, through frozen roads, through enemy resistance, on December 26th, Patton's spearhead broke through to Bastogne, lifting the siege. The contrast could not have been sharper. Patton attacked. Montgomery paused. To the American commanders watching from their headquarters, it felt less like cooperation and more like captivity. Their armies were engaged in the most desperate battle of the Western Front. Yet they were being held back by a man who seemed more concerned with proving a point than winning quickly. But Montgomery's restraint on the battlefield was matched by aggression elsewhere. Between December 25, 1944, and January 1, 1945, the telegraph lines between Belgium and London glowed hot with tension. Montgomery bypassed Eisenhower entirely. He did not raise his concerns through the established chain of command. Instead, he wrote directly and privately to Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff. These were not measured reports. They were indictments. In a telegram dated December 27th, Montgomery declared that the American command was in complete disarray. He claimed there was no grip on operations, no coherence, no leadership worthy of the scale of the war. He asserted that without his intervention, the Northern Front would have collapsed entirely. He implied that Eisenhower's decisions had invited disaster. Then he made his demand. Montgomery argued that the only viable solution was to place all Allied ground forces under a single operational commander himself. Eisenhower, he suggested, should be reduced to a symbolic role, managing politics while professionals conducted the war. It was an audacious proposal and a reckless one. Montgomery did not limit himself to strategic critique. In private letters sent days later, he attacked the American army at its core. He described American troops as brave but ineffective, courageous but poorly trained. He blamed their officers for lacking discipline and experience. He ignored the reality unfolding in the snow-covered forest. By that point, American forces had suffered roughly 75,000 casualties in the Ardennes. Nearly 19,000 were dead. They had held against elite SS Panzer divisions in sub-zero temperatures, often with inadequate equipment and little rest. Montgomery did not see sacrifice. He saw validation. What made the situation even more dangerous was Montgomery's confidence. He believed his reputation shielded him. He assumed that his status as Britain's most famous general made his communications untouchable. Some of his language was barely disguised. Some messages were insufficiently encrypted. He was effectively lobbying the British government to overthrow the existing Allied command structure. It was nothing less than an attempted coup conducted through telegraph wires instead of rifles. Montgomery was gambling everything, his career, his legacy, the alliance itself, and he was convinced he held the winning hand. He was wrong. The detonation did not come quietly. It did not happen in a secure office or behind closed doors. It happened under bright lights in front of microphones with the world watching, On January 7, 1945, Montgomery called a press conference at his headquarters. He spoke for exactly 30 minutes. In that half hour, he inflicted more damage on Allied unity than the German offensive had managed in weeks. Standing before dozens of reporters, Montgomery delivered what he clearly believed was a triumphant explanation of events. He framed the Battle of the Bulge not as a desperate defensive struggle by American forces, but as a problem he had personally solved. He used the word "I" repeatedly, 57 times by some counts. He described how he had taken control, how he had stabilized the front, how he had employed the full strength of British forces to rescue the Americans from catastrophe. The facts told a different story. British units had played a limited role in the fighting, primarily in the later stages. The bulk of the combat had been borne by American divisions. Casualty figures made the imbalance impossible to ignore. American losses approached 90,000. British losses numbered around 1,400. Montgomery did not mention Patton's relief of Estonia. He barely acknowledged Bradley. He portrayed the Americans as disorganized and panicked, saved only by British professionalism. When transcripts of the press conference reached American headquarters, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Omar Bradley, normally restrained and soft-spoken, erupted. He slammed his fist against his matboard and declared that he would never again serve under Montgomery's command. The insult was no longer private. It was public, irreversible. The alliance had been wounded in full view of the world, and the news was just reaching Dwight D. Eisenhower. The transcript of Montgomery's press conference reached Eisenhower's headquarters at Versailles like a physical blow. Eisenhower had endured slights before. He had swallowed insults, absorbed criticism, and tolerated condescension in the name of unity. He had allowed generals to vent, posture, and maneuver so long as the alliance held. That had always been his line: unity first, pride second. This time, something was different. The press conference was not just arrogance, it was betrayal made public. It exposed everything Eisenhower had worked to keep hidden: division, resentment, and distrust. At the exact moment, the Allies needed the appearance of absolute cohesion. Intelligence officers placed Montgomery's secret telegrams beside the press transcript on Eisenhower's desk. The pattern was undeniable: private sabotage followed by public humiliation, a coordinated effort to undermine his authority. Eisenhower did not react theatrically. There was no shouting, no slam fists. He sat in silence, cigarette smoke curling upward as he read and reread the documents. The room was cold, the windows rattled faintly in the winter wind. For years, Eisenhower had been the glue holding the coalition together. Now he saw clearly that the glue was failing. He reached into his desk and removed a blank sheet of paper. What he began to write was not a threat. It was an ultimatum, addressed to General George C. Marshall in Washington. The message was calm, professional, and devastating. Eisenhower stated that he could no longer function effectively alongside Field Marshal Montgomery. He made it clear that the situation had become untenable. Then came the final sentence: if Montgomery remained in his position, Eisenhower asked to be relieved of his own command. It was the nuclear option. Eisenhower understood the balance of power better than anyone. The United States supplied the overwhelming majority of men, equipment, fuel, and ammunition in Europe. Without American leadership, the Allied war effort would fracture instantly. This was not a bluff. Eisenhower was willing to walk away. The draft cable was prepared for encryption. Clerks began the routine procedures, and then, at the last possible moment, a British officer realized what was about to happen. Major General Francis de Gingong, Montgomery's own chief of staff, saw the message. He understood immediately what it meant. If that cable was sent, the war would not stop, but the alliance might not survive it. Washington would not sacrifice Eisenhower. Montgomery would be finished, and Britain's position as a partner, not a subordinate, would evaporate overnight. Gingong did not waste time. He rushed to the phone and contacted London. When Winston Churchill received the news, the effect was immediate and visceral. Churchill was a romantic, but he was not a fool. He did not see this as a clash of personalities. He saw it as a matter of survival. Britain in 1945 was exhausted, financially crippled. Its manpower reserves were stretched to the breaking point. It depended on American industry for fuel, food, vehicles, aircraft, and ammunition. Lend-lease was not a convenience. It was a lifeblood. If Eisenhower resigned, or if the United States publicly rebuked Britain over Montgomery, American public opinion would turn cold. Congress would ask uncomfortable questions. Support would waver, and Joseph Stalin would smile. Churchill understood something Montgomery never had. The war was no longer about prestige or seniority. The era of British dominance was ending, and the transition was already underway. Montgomery had pushed too far. Churchill summoned his advisers and dictated his response. There was no room for diplomacy, no gentle language. This was not a moment for reassurance. Dingen was sent back to Montgomery's headquarters with a message stripped of sentiment. Eisenhower has a gun to your head. He will pull the trigger. You have 24 hours. When the message reached Montgomery, the transformation was immediate. The confident warlord vanished. The man who had believed himself indispensable suddenly understood how isolated he was. For the first time, the scales fell from his eyes. This was no longer a dispute over strategy. This was about power, real power, industrial power, political power, the kind that decided who stayed and who disappeared. Churchill's message did not appeal to friendship or shared history. It appealed to reality. Britain was now the junior partner. Montgomery was ordered to apologize fully, publicly, without qualification. That night, inside his caravan, Montgomery sat hunched over a desk, his posture stiff, his expression hollow. Dingen stood nearby, not as an advisor, but as an enforcer. The terms were non-negotiable. Montgomery picked up his pen. The letter began formally, almost defensively. He expressed regret that his press conference had caused difficulty. He insisted that he had never intended to harm Eisenhower personally. Then came the line that mattered, the line Churchill had demanded, a complete retraction. He wrote that American soldiers were brave and fighting magnificently, that it was an honor to serve alongside them, that their sacrifices were beyond question. And finally, the closing, your very devoted subordinate, Clear's throat Monty. The word lingered on the page, subordinate, for a man who had spent his life believing in hierarchy, entitlement, in seniority. It was the most painful admission imaginable. The letter was sent. The next morning, Eisenhower read it quietly. He did not savor it. He did not gloat. He took the draft of his resignation cable, crumpled it, and dropped it into the trash. His reply was brief, almost casual. Thanks, Monty. Let's get on with the war. The crisis passed, but nothing returned to normal. The apology saved Montgomery's position, but it destroyed his influence. Eisenhower no longer trusted London's counsel. The strategic balance shifted decisively. When the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine, Montgomery insisted on a grand, deliberate operation in the north. Eisenhower allowed it, but he no longer waited on it. In the south, Patton and Bradley moved with speed and flexibility, while Montgomery assembled massive artillery concentrations and rehearsed every detail. American armor slipped across the river, gaining ground before the British offensive even fully began. The broad front strategy Montgomery despised became doctrine. American armies surged across Germany, exploiting breakthroughs, encircling enemy formations, and overwhelming resistance through momentum alone. The British 21st Army Group followed behind, securing flanks and consolidating gains. By May 1945, the reality was undeniable. More than 3 million American soldiers stood in Europe. The scale of their presence dwarfed everything else. When victory photographs were taken, the center belonged to the United States. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered for frozen foxholes, shattered forests, and the courage of the 101st Airborne. But the most dangerous moment of that winter did not occur under fire. It occurred in a telegraph office.